Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. Today I've got a very interesting topic for you. So my last essay that I submitted was on the microdosing of psychedelic drugs, and it was a 3,000 word essay. I really enjoyed researching it and writing it, and when I was wrapping it up and submitting it, there was so much information that I couldn't include in it. And even though it was quite a long essay, I still felt, wow, there's incredibly interesting and important things which aren't included in this essay. So I said to myself, do you know what? It's high time that I made another video for the channel and really shared this important and interesting information with you. So this video will probably be a little bit longer than some of my last few videos, but trust me, it will be worth it because psychedelic microdosing is just so interesting. So I'm going to be talking about the history of psychedelics, the research involved in psychedelic microdosing, some of the kind of practical uses, some of the outcomes from that use, and some of the challenges and benefits with the practice, and then kind of, where we are now, and then just a few final comments from my own perspective, and I suppose kind of tying everything in together with some important caveats. So to begin, regarding the history of psychedelic drugs, it appears that humankind has used them since dating back as far back as around 6000 BC. There's evidence for Saharan communities using psilocybin mushrooms in religious ceremonies. So they're not new to humans. In many ways, they're new to modern research. It's kind of an obvious statement. Modern research, everything is new to modern research, but their use case is actually very, very, very old in terms of human history. So we're no stranger to psychedelic drugs. Some important kind of definitions for the rest of this video. The difference between what I call a macrodose and a microdose. So there's kind of a bright line between them in the research. For psilocybin, they say that anything over 2 milligrams of psilocybin is a macrodose, and anything under that is a microdose. And kind of in subjective terms or in experiential terms, what that means is that, generally speaking, a person who takes 2 milligrams of psilocybin, they won't have any kind of the classic hallucinatory effects. Like they won't maybe see colours, they won't have visual hallucinations, they won't have auditory hallucinations, they won't have different forms of hallucination. Whereas if you take above that, well, then that's when you get the kind of classic consequences of taking a psychedelic drug. So that's the difference between a macrodose and a microdose. And you'll hear me talking about LSD, DMT and psilocybin. So what LSD is, it's an acronym for lysergic acid diethylamide, and DMT is an acronym for N,N-dimethyltryptamine. So if you want to do some research after the video, I'd highly encourage it on these substances. So a bit of background to psychedelics and why I'm even talking about them today. So there is an emotional health crisis in the world. People are struggling gravely, and it can even be measured in economic terms. The World Health Organization, who we hear so much about lately, given the current global pandemic, they have put a recent estimate, it was last year, on emotional health issues, costs to the economy of $1 trillion US. So obviously that is huge. Anything that we as individuals or companies can do to try and help solve this problem will result in huge increases in productivity from an economic perspective, but more meaningfully, it will result in people living happier, more fulfilled lives. It will enable an amount of human flourishing which we have not seen in recent history, if we can really, really put it up to the part of the human condition which really troubles us so much. So that's why I suppose so many people want to, there are so many incentives to tackle this crisis. from an economic perspective and from a humanitarian perspective. And then when it comes to the typical pharmacological treatments for different, what you see in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the classic kind of antidepressant medication, your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, your SSRIs, they're not great. And personally, I would go as far as to say, excuse my language, they're fucking shit. They're not that much better than placebo treatments that have a horrible effect profile. I heard an interesting distinction recently that nothing has a side effect, it just has effects. And maybe one of the effects of antidepressants is that in some people they relieve their depressive symptoms, but they also have other effects for people too, and that includes sexual dysfunction, weight gain. The SSRIs in themselves are kind of addictive. Now, they're not addictive in the traditional sense, in that they're addictive in a similar sense than maybe how nicotine is addictive. So an addiction to nicotine doesn't necessarily destroy your relationships with your family. If you're consuming your nicotine via smoking cigarettes, you're likely destroying your lungs, and evidence has shown now that vaping is horrific for your lungs too. But the drug itself, it's kind of, a lot of research would suggest that it's kind of benign depending on how you consume it. Whereas something like alcohol will ruin your family, will likely ruin your family relationships and maybe take you away from your job. Antidepressants don't do that. Antidepressants, you stay on them and you might suffer, as I said, some sexual dysfunction, some weight gain, but it's just not, we don't consider them addictive, but maybe we should, because they're very, very, very hard to safely get off. Oftentimes people, they're fed up, they want to stop their antidepressant medication and they stop taking them. That is very ill-advised. You need to taper your consumption of antidepressants over a long time course. You reduce it systematically and steadily with the help of instruction from your GP. Because if you don't do that, you can really, really suffer some basically terrible withdrawal symptoms like, increased depression, so way worse than what you were maybe experiencing before, and you might even begin to feel suicidal. So if I haven't made a strong enough case already, I'll finish talking about SSRIs and just saying that they're pretty shit. If you want to look up some antidepressant limitations in the research, do some Googling. I'd highly recommend you do it. And this effect profile of antidepressants and other drugs which are targeting different emotional health problems, the bad effects of them and the limitations of them has kind of spurred a lot of research in recent years on drugs that were originally or drugs that are typically considered drugs of abuse. So you're likely to have heard of ketamine and MDMA. Ketamine, famous as a horse tranquilizer, and being used and abused in kind of party scenarios, has actually shown extremely strong evidence for its use in a clinical setting in the treatment of major depressive disorder, which is huge. It's typically considered treatment resistant. So, if you have somebody who's in a terrible, dangerously suicidal state in a clinical environment, when you administer ketamine alongside some psychotherapy, they are alleviated from those symptoms typically in this research, and it's shown extremely promising results in research over the past few years. Similarly, MDMA, in Ireland, what we're often referred to as, pills or Molly, or, in the party setting, MDMA has been given breakthrough status by the United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, breakthrough status as an adjunct treatment to psychotherapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And perhaps of kind of greatest relevance to this video, psilocybin has also received breakthrough status as a treatment for major depressive disorder. much like ketamine when it's used alongside psychotherapy. So that's just kind of setting the scene of the last few years and where we are with the research. Specifically in relation to microdosing, there's been a lot of different articles, autobiographies, kind of non-fiction books, which have really kind of brought the practice to the forefront. So you have Eilert Waldman's autobiography, you have James Fadiman, who wrote a book about microdosing, and you also have another very famous book which was released recently by Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind, and it's about kind of psychedelics more generally, typically about microdosing. So just loads of YouTube videos about psychedelics, about microdosing, about their purported benefits, and I suppose I don't want to just add to those because there's going to be a distinct critique of the practice as I proceed, and you're going to see some confirmation bias in me because I really want this to be a success, and that mightn't be noted by other people, so just keep that in mind as I proceed. So considering this popularity, there's been a lot of investment despite the illegal status of psychedelic drugs pretty much across the board internationally, with an interesting exception which I'll get to later. So funnily enough, there's a bit of confusion as to what a psychedelic is. So this video is going to exclusively focus on the classical definition of psychedelic drugs. So those drugs which act upon a serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A. I'm not going to be talking about the use of or the microdosing of cannabis as a psychedelic, or ketamine is often considered a psychedelic too. Their effects are mediated through different receptors, and if there's argument as to whether they are psychedelic or not. So I'm going to focus more on those drugs like DMT, LSD and psilocybin, which I referenced earlier. So although there's been a renewed interest with the different books and articles and YouTube videos that I referenced earlier, there has been a lot of research on psychedelic drugs in the 20th century, prior to the 1970s when they were illegalized. And this research demonstrated that psychedelic drugs show great promise as adjunct therapies to psychotherapy and also as models of psychosis. If you want to know what it feels like to be what many people call insane and crazy, if you take a large dose of a psychedelic drug, you'll know, and you'll certainly experience empathy for these people who seem so strange and unusual. But kind of more recently, because of their illegal status, it's so unfortunate, most of the research that has been done has been called citizen science. So citizen science is fantastic, but it's totally different. It's not the same as empirical research done by labs and universities that can control for so many variables that citizen science is going to struggle to. But nonetheless, citizen science has been very, very, very important. And kind of what I mean by this is research done by the general population, not by scientific academics in many cases, but by everyday people from all different walks of life who are experimenting with different amounts of drugs, with different drugs, and reporting on the benefits or the negative aspects of the substance, of use of that substance. And they may be reported online, and they might share it in online fora. And there's a really strong psychedelic community online. You'll see lots of citizen scientists discussing their own experiences and their own advice for people going forward, which has proved to be very important. And it's this kind of citizen science has been reported in the literature by James Fadiman and his colleague Sophia Korb, and also by different research teams like Anderson and colleagues in 2019. If you want links to these research articles, please ask me in the comments and I'll provide them there below. So first off, Cameron and colleagues last year, they did research using microdoses of DMT on rats, and using one administration every 3 days, this microdose protocol, they found that the rats produced less anxious and depressive behavior in animal models of depression and anxiety. So in what's called the elevated plus maze, which is basically a platform in the shape of a plus sign or a cross, and it's open, and its parts of the arms are open. So the more time that a rat uses to explore the open space suggests that it's less anxious, because it's not trying to hide in behind walls, it's happy to explore in the open. So they were shown to explore the open arms of the elevated plus maze more, suggesting less anxiety. And in the forced swim test, where these tests are kind of fucking horrible, but in the forced swim test, you put a rat in a little swimming pool and you see how long it swims for. So if it only swims for a little bit, it gives up and just floats there, kind of, not trying to get out, that's a sign that, this rat is likely kind of depressed. And it's shown some validity as an animal model of human depression. So the microdose for the rats, it produced an effect such that the rat swam for longer than rats who weren't given the microdose of DMT. So that kind of converges with a lot of the self-reports of people who microdose, that they feel less anxious and they feel less depressed. So that's kind of some interesting preliminary research, but the research is done on rats. Rats aren't people, but it's kind of indicative of maybe where we could be going with maybe human research in the future. And of course we won't be putting humans in an elevated plus maze or in a swimming pool. Thankfully they can tell us if they're feeling more or less anxious or depressed. Then also in research also conducted last year, there actually was a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind research project run using human subjects. And randomized placebo-controlled double-blind, that's really like the holy grail of research. Placebo-controlled, you also administer, you have the exact same administration protocol, but instead of providing a biologically active substance or substance which you think might be biologically active, you give them an innate substance like a piece of sugar or something which you're not expecting to affect symptoms of depression or anxiety. Double blind, neither the participant or the experimenter know what is being done. So the experimenter doesn't know if they're giving you a placebo or an active dose, and obviously the person doesn't know either. That knowledge is only known by maybe the research supervisor. And then randomized, you have a population and you're not selecting for who you're giving the microdose to or the placebo to. You're choosing it completely at random. So that's really as I said, the holy grail of research. Now, interestingly, Madsen and colleagues didn't find any significant changes in their participants who were in the microdosing protocol versus the placebo control. Now, this study was marred by a lot of limitations. I'll just bring a couple to light. There are more, and many of these are highlighted by the authors themselves. And these include that the dosing protocol was kind of atypical. Like when you look at the citizen science, most people follow what is called either the Fadiman, named after James Fadiman, or the Paul Stamets, or the Stamets protocol. The Fadiman protocol involves taking a microdose on one day, and then on days 2 and 3, no microdose. And then you repeat that cycle for a month. And then the Stamets protocol is you take a microdose every day for 5 days, followed by 2 days off, and then you repeat the cycle. So 5 days on, 2 days off, 1 day on, 2 days off. Those are kind of the main protocols which people follow. Well, what they used in this study was one microdose, at which point there would be a break between the first and the second of at least a week. So it didn't really show great validity for what other people are actually doing. I don't know why they chose that dosing regimen. And furthermore, even more controversial, all the participants in their study had actually used psychedelic drugs before. So it's possible that if psychedelic drugs do confer a benefit, this population already experienced it. And that's why, microdosing for one half versus no microdosing for the other half didn't make any difference, because they were both probably on the same playing field, because they both had both populations, or both halves of the same population, they had experience of consuming psychedelic drugs. So it's marred by limitations, but interestingly, it's very easy for me to point out those limitations when I disagree with the results that they got. And that's an element of my own confirmation bias, which is important to be forthcoming with. It's harder for me to talk about the limitations of the other research which reported positive results, but I'll do my best. As I mentioned previously, some of the more kind of promising research for psychedelics comes from self-report, survey research, citizen science. And Anderson and colleagues last year conducted a study online which interrogated how people felt subjectively about their microdosing experience. And they found that people reported decreases in negative emotionality, decreases in dysfunctional attitudes, increases in wisdom, open-mindedness and creativity. So great stuff. But it's a survey. Sometimes people lie on surveys. Survey research isn't very reliable. People can be subject to their own confirmation biases. Maybe those effects were placebo effects, or there's an awful lot of play there, which kind of again mars the quality of the research. So really, take home message: we need to conduct more research. But let me discuss some more points. So who microdoses? It's funnily enough, it's not just healthy. It's not just people who are feeling unhealthy, but it's also healthy people. So you have people who don't really have any complaints about their depression or about any depression or anxiety, but maybe they want to increase their productivity at work, or they want to improve their academic performance. And you can see loads of articles of the intellectual elite who work in Silicon Valley taking microdosing. It's very popular in Silicon Valley, and in some of the kind of really prestigious universities, the students who want to get a competitive edge, they're microdosing as well. So there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence suggesting that this is a good idea. But again, these are news reports. This isn't empirical science that's been peer reviewed in a journal. So again, promising but not ideal. Interestingly, from the healthy perspective, it's not a recreational use that people are microdosing for. People don't microdose to get a buzz or anything. If you're getting a buzz from microdosing, you're not microdosing, because microdosing by definition means you're getting a sub-perceptual effect. Now, obviously, you perceive your hand going to your mouth and ingesting the drug, but you don't have visual hallucinations. A particular strength of the research in microdosing's favour goes to show that expectancy bias doesn't seem to play that large a role, if any, in the outcomes of microdosing. So, Leto and Stevenson last year, again, all this research is very, very new. They measured the self-reported outcomes of people who microdosed versus the expected outcomes of prospective microdosers, so people who are about to microdose. And they found that they were actually very, very different. So what people expect doesn't seem to be convergent with what actually occurs for people. Now, fortunately, this research, again, it was between groups. It was one group who had microdosed and one group who hadn't. It wasn't the same group. It wasn't, what do you expect to happen? Okay, go and microdose. What actually happened? It wasn't a within group. It was a between group analysis, which again is just a problem with that research. Another difficulty with the research is that it's on different psychedelic drugs. I mentioned psilocybin, DMT, LSD. These three drugs have very, very different potencies. So, the maximum dose that one can consider a microdose is around 2 milligrams of psilocybin. Whereas for LSD, it's 13 micrograms, which is nearly 200 times less the quantity of what a microdose of psilocybin is. And then for DMT, research kind of shows that around 7 milligrams of DMT is around about a microdose. So some of them are way, way stronger, so you have to take way, way less, and some of them are way, way weaker, so you have to take way, way more. It's an interesting consideration, and of further interest, what is the best option? Does microdosing all these drugs have the same effect? And if not, which one's more beneficial? Or is there an instance in which, DMT is better than LSD? Or, if I'm feeling depressed, should I only take psilocybin? Or is psilocybin the go-to no matter what the issue is? And you'll see a lot of conflicting reports in both the academic literature and the kind of citizen science literature. Just a few more kind of subjective reports that were reported by Fadiman and Korb last year. Now, again, these results are marred by their self-report nature, but they had a huge sample. Over 1,000 people responded to their survey, responded to their study. So, generally speaking, people reported improvements in their lives. I think it was 80% of the participants reported improvements in their lives. Some people reported an increase in their anxiety, which obviously isn't ideal. If you're feeling anxious, it's not a good idea to engage in microdosing, it would seem. At least not under maybe some clinical supervision, if it's prescribed by a doctor, which isn't going to happen for a long time because of their illegal status. But anyway, Fadiman and Korb, they reported increases in kindness, patience, openness, creativity, productivity in their participants. And these effects, interestingly, were noticed by the families of the participants. At least according to the participants, they were. So that's interesting, It's one thing to think that your kindness and patience has increased. It's very easy to say, oh yeah, I'm a kinder and more patient person after I went for that jog today. But if your family don't recognise it, well then you might be mistaken. Similarly, improvements in symptoms for people with bad migraines, traumatic brain injury, bad menstruation symptoms, allergies, shingles, they all reported improvements. Now, again, if you were to read this research, it would seem like microdosing is the silver bullet for all the problems with humanity, and that's not what it's going to be. It's really not. So it's an interesting consideration to make. If let's say you're a member of one of those populations, well, maybe this is worth trying. Have you tried everything else? Have you tried a lot of maybe drugs which are legal? Different pain medications, but different opioid medications. Have they improved, or have they had terrible problems associated with them? No. Yes. No. Okay. Well, maybe I should or shouldn't try a microdose or a macrodose of psychedelics. But it's one thing to take your advice from a YouTube video, and it's another thing to take your advice from your doctor. And it's just so unfortunate that we have the illegal status of psychedelics. Anyway, I digress. Interestingly, they show great promise as a method for tapering antidepressants. So I mentioned earlier, antidepressants are very hard to get off, but microdosing, at least for the participants in this study, seemed to help taper them off, which is really, 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 really great. But again, it's not experimental research. Interestingly, this is an aside to all the research I've been discussing previously. This again was a randomized, double-blind and placebo-controlled experiment that was done by an academic institution. People who microdosed LSD were shown to overrepresent intervals of time 2 seconds and longer. So what does that mean in practical terms? People who microdose LSD, so people who don't have any perceptual effects of the drug, people who don't know they've even received the drug, for these 2 second intervals, it felt longer for them. It felt longer than the 2 seconds felt for the people who didn't receive the microdose. So that's very, very interesting. And, I was thinking to myself, like, what are the implications there? Does that mean that these people or does that mean that people who receive a microdose of LSD are more attuned to stimuli over that period of time? I don't know, maybe. Does that mean that for people where a quick reaction time is important, a microdose of LSD could help them? Maybe, maybe not. Just a very interesting consideration. And now maybe it'll end up just being research for research's sake, which is I'm very curious about. Not everything requires a practical application, but I just thought it was quite interesting. Now, again, to the end of this little presentation on psychedelic microdosing, I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges and the benefits associated with microdosing. So, as I said, looking at some of the research, you might be thinking, oh my God, this is going to solve all the ailments of society. And it's just not the case. And interestingly, despite how much promise it shows in many studies, what a general statement you'll see coming up is that macrodosing is expected to have much greater effects, much greater benefits. So those doses which do involve perceptual changes and distortions of time and delusions, when consumed in a supervised setting alongside psychotherapy, it's expected to have a much, much, much greater impact for the person. So microdosing might be good, maybe good, it's hard to know, but if it is, it's unlikely to be nearly as efficacious as macrodosing. However, there are huge limitations associated with macrodosing. You need clinical supervision. You need to be looked after when you're having a trip, because you are a danger to yourself and potentially everyone around you, because you're not living in those moments under the influence of a psychedelic macrodose. You're not living in the real world. You're interacting with basically the constructs of your mind. So it's impossible to act in that imagined environment safely. So you need supervision. Whereas microdosing might mitigate those effects. For people who have a predisposition for psychosis, it may be the case that a psychedelic drug may amplify their psychosis or bring on a psychotic episode, which is quite dangerous. So, anybody who's going to be involved in these studies, or hopefully one day psychedelic drugs will be legal and regulated, if they're going to be prescribed to people, you're going to want to do some screening. Is this person at risk at an increased risk for psychosis after this drug administration? That's not something you want to risk. Interestingly, psychedelic drugs activate the 5-HT2A receptor, as I mentioned previously, and some second messenger cascades resultant from that receptor activation have been implicated in the development of both autism and Alzheimer's disease. So it's not to say there's not that link hasn't been solidified and concretized in the literature. It's a putative link. It's suggested. So maybe if a child was to come across psychedelics, maybe they have an increased risk for developing autism, or maybe people who consume psychedelic drugs are at an increased risk for giving birth to autistic children. Maybe not, but maybe that's what's in the literature anyway. It's also been implicated in Alzheimer's disease. So, you're going to need some longitudinal research, research that occurs over a very, very long time, assessing people who take psychedelic drugs and doing different physiological and psychological tests across their lifetime to see, did that person develop Alzheimer's, or did they develop something like Alzheimer's, or did they give birth to autistic children, or did they develop autistic symptoms themselves? Yes, dodgy, no, okay, the link isn't there. I mentioned how these psychedelic drugs are basically illegal across the board worldwide. Interestingly, in Holland, because of a legal loophole, the sale of psychedelic truffles, so basically an underground fungus, is legal. And despite their legality in the Netherlands, there is still a emotional health crisis in Holland. So, making these drugs legal overnight isn't going to solve the problems, because we still see issues in the Netherlands. So it's a very, very interesting kind of consideration. Now, the use case in the Netherlands is, often by tourists who just want to go and have a trip when they're on holidays or partying. I haven't seen any reports of clinicians in the Netherlands prescribing psychedelic truffles. So, their use case, the way they're used in the Netherlands might be a reason why there's still such a terrible mental or emotional health crisis, in the Netherlands. But it remains to be seen. Physiologically speaking, there are some kind of cardiovascular effects of psychedelic drugs, so they increase your blood pressure ever so slightly. So if you're in a cardiovascular risk group where an increase in blood pressure could be of detriment to your health, psychedelics unlikely to be a good idea. But the amount at which they increase your blood pressure is minimal. It's significant, but it's minimal. And so it requires care in its administration and its consumption. Kind of in terms of future directions, we see a lot of investment in psychedelic research ongoing. And there's a company called Compass who just in the last 2 weeks received $80 million in funding for their psychedelic research, and that's additional to $38 million they received in October 2018. So there are economic incentives, as I discussed previously, for psychedelic research, and those incentives are being realised at present, thankfully. So hopefully we'll see the legal status of these drugs change so that more research can be conducted and we can really start to robustly interrogate, are these drugs effective at reducing human suffering or improving productivity? And could they be used by non-clinical populations as a prophylactic, to prevent the occurrence of, emotional health problems? If microdosing or macrodosing is used by people who've never experienced any emotional health issues, can we help prevent them from developing those health issues in the future? Because I don't want the healthy people in the world to suffer the lows of the lows. Now I think it's important that people understand what anxiety and sadness is, through experience, but I don't think people need to experience clinical levels of sadness and anxiety to live a fulfilled life. Not at all. So it might be an extremely important prophylactics supplement in the future, considering how loneliness is increasing to horrible levels. And interestingly, psychedelics are reported to increase sociality, so how often you interact with other people. So it may help counteract loneliness and addictions as well. Macrodoses of psychedelics have shown incredible promise for the treatment of substance use disorders. So alcoholism, opioid addiction, these supervised administrations of macrodoses really, really seem to help these people, and these people are often those members of our population who we think are too far gone to help. No, they're done. We can't help them. They're just they're an addict. They're an addict now, and they're written off. And here's this promising technology, this promising psychedelic technology that we can apply to these people and maybe change their lives and all the lives of those around them. So there's great promise there. I did mention the effects of ketamine and MDMA on major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. Psychedelic drugs also show great promise for these disorders. So hopefully, for these traditionally considered treatment-resistant disorders, we can use psychedelic drugs to actually treat these people alongside using psychotherapy alongside their administration. That seems to be an important, very important variable, and where you have somebody to guide somebody through their psychedelic experience if they're taking a macrodose, or to just check in with them if they are microdosing. One of the final points to note, and it's kind of it's close to my heart. In terms of the stresses that the terminally ill face, psychedelic administration seems to alleviate a lot of the anxiety and the depression associated with dying. And I think there is an ethical imperative upon us to really help the most vulnerable in our society. I've talked about people with, major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, people in addiction, and people on death's door who are struggling so much with their mortality. We should be doing everything we can to help them. And that might mean conducting more research on psychedelics, and that might mean you, as an individual, talking to your local politician and asking them, what are you doing about psychedelic research? What are you doing to help all the terminally ill people in this country face their mortality? What are you doing to help all those people in addiction who are considered lost causes? What are you doing to help all those people who've experienced such atrocious trauma in their childhood that they're considered treatment resistant now? What are you doing for those people? Have you looked at the research on psychedelic drugs? If you haven't, why haven't you? If you have, why aren't you doing something about it? It's time to start doing something about these horrible ailments in our society. Now, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about psychedelic research, which is an important consideration when you're listening to me make all these statements about the potential efficacy of psychedelic drugs. Am I falling victim to confirmation bias? Am I only seeing the research which supports my argument, which supports what I want to see? I want to help people who are terminally ill. I want to help people who are in addiction. I want to help people who are considered treatment resistant. Is that skewing my reading of the literature? Very possibly. Now, maybe I'm on the money. I hope I am. But oftentimes, I'm not on the money. Oftentimes, the greatest experts in the world make mistakes. And I'm no great expert on much. So engage in some of your own critical thinking. Look up the research on psychedelic drugs in the literature yourself. Make up your own mind. Weigh up the evidence. What makes the most sense to you? Before I wrap up, I'd like to just propose some interesting thought experiments for you. If psychedelics are useful, should we be forced to use them? What are the ethical implications of that? If they do increase productivity in the workforce, imagine the company you're working for says, right, everybody has to take psychedelics. If you're not taking psychedelics, you're gone because you're not as productive as you could be. That's not really ideal, is it? And that seems to be kind of the culture in Silicon Valley at the moment. If you're not microdosing, you're not reaching your fullest potential. That seems to be in the cultural ether. I'm not saying that that's a fact, but that seems to be something that's accepted by many people. So there's some interesting ethical considerations to make there. And maybe not everybody will be able to, if they are beneficial, for, generally speaking, not everybody's going to be able to experience that benefit without some effects of the drug. Because interestingly, for people who are colorblind, they experience tracers. And a tracer is, imagine you're under the influence of a psychedelic drug and you see a light source here and you focus upon it, and then you move your head to the left and a line follows with you from that source, like a tracer line. That happens for people who have colour blindness when they take psychedelic drugs. So that's an interesting consideration. Are you colourblind? Taking psychedelic drugs mightn't be ideal unless you want to have loads of tracers in your field of view. Although I've reported some research which has shown the efficacy of psychedelic drugs for reducing symptoms of anxiety, there has been other research to suggest that it can amplify anxiety. So if you are feeling anxious, maybe microdosing or macrodosing mightn't be the best option for you. And it's just so hard to determine without the guidance of a clinical professional, which I am not. And a lot of the research, again, I discussed, it talks about statistically significant results. statistical significance is very, very, very different to clinical significance. So if you have research conducted on 1 million people and everybody in the experimental group, they report a 0.5% increase in well-being. That is a statistically significant effect on their well-being. But you ask one person, how is your well-being? 0.5% is basically meaningless to them. It's not clinical significance. So a lot of the reports that I provided are statistically significant, but they are not necessarily clinically significant. And a final point that's interesting to consider, and I'm going to finish up after this one, is that people who engage in psychedelic microdosing or psychedelic macrodosing in the citizen science literature, when they do that, they've acted in their environment in such a way as to improve themselves. Merely by acting, they've taken a step closer to well-being. So taking that step in itself may account for the benefits they experience. There are many, many, many different ways we can take steps towards well-being. They can be routinely exercising every day for 30 minutes, be that going for a jog, or maybe it can be beginning a push-up regime where you're going to do 20 push-ups a day for the next month. That's a step closer to well-being. Going to bed at the same time, getting up at the same time, that's a step closer to well-being. There are many, many, many steps we can take to go in the direction of well-being that don't involve ingesting psychedelic drugs. I think there is a bias for people to want to ingest a substance which will improve their quality of life. We don't always have to ingest a substance. We don't always have to eat that bar of chocolate to feel better. We don't always have to drink that 7th pint to get, a better buzz. We don't always have to look at psychedelic research to try and find something that will improve our lives. There are very simple things we know that can improve our lives, such as the things I outlined. In addition to those, connecting with your friends and family, especially given the current circumstances. This is something that's known to improve your well-being. So I'd like to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to making another video for you again soon.